Welcome to Second Tech Talk Tuesday, glass cutting and breaking and proper tool use. Everyone has bad habits. We all form them. I form them too. And sometimes your bad habits work really well for you. And so I say keep up with your bad habits. However, if you are having difficulty, it could be because of those bad habits. So we're going to go through all the different tools, all the different types of cutters, and different tips and tricks to help you break things successfully. Okay? So very first thing we'll talk about is safety. You should wear safety glasses when you cut glass. How's that for the insurance shot?
Fantastic.
Okay, so there are different types of glass cutters. All stained glass cutters are oil wicked. It's very important. The oil is there to remove the glass grit from the glass cutting surface so that it doesn't dull. It's also there to keep all the metal parts moving fluidly so nothing rusts. You always want to keep your glass cutter in a nose down position because it is a wick that goes between the cutter head and the canister. So you want it always to be wet. If you put a little rag or a tissue with some of the cutter fluid inside, leave your cutter nose down in it, the oil just goes back and forth through the wick. Okay, it's very, very important. Old style cutters used to be dipped, so a lot of the old school glaziers will use kerosene and they'll just dip their cutters in kerosene. It's for the same reason. In this case, we have the reservoirs that can be filled with oil. We don't have to do the dipping. Okay. It's more important your cutter be oily than dry. A couple things to make a note of. Don't over tighten the screw at the top of your glass cutter. If it is too tight, the pressure is there's too much pressure in the canister and you don't get a good flow. So you just want to turn it until it stops and allow for a nice flow between your canister and your cutter head. I know we're always tempted to crank on it, right? Because you're traveling with it, you don't want it to tip over and spill or any of those things, and that's fine. But just remember to loosen it up again when you're using it. Also, because you're applying pressure on it, if this screw is too tight, then you're more likely to get pressure cracks because it's just a plastic reservoir. Okay. You can cover your cutter with a glass cozy if the oily feel that sometimes gets on the outside is bothersome.
It's
Great
also
feel.
very good if you have arthritis in the hands.
That is a good, very good point.
Yeah, it's a
Very good
little
point. Softer on the hand.
Yes, oh yeah.
Good.
And a bigger grip, yeah.
Yeah.
So that being said, there's different types of glass cutter heads out there on the market. I've got three in particular here. This is what we call a pattern head. This allows you the ease and flexibility of moving around different shapes. It pivots and it plunges. The plunging is important. It's what activates the wick. So you'll see I've got a nice oil line, which means my cutter is in good shape. Okay, and the pivoting is important because it allows you to make fluid curves without that slide. Then you can go into more of an industrial pattern head or a stock head, and it gives you greater stability when you're working long scores. So generally when I'm cutting stock glass or 4 mil or 5 mil glass, I'll switch to the wider head when I'm using it against my ruler. It runs a little more dependably. And then lastly, I have here a cutter head meant for thicker glass, and I'm going to show you how I use that on the pot melt. The difference between these heads is this one here has a more shallow angle. Okay, so the pattern heads at the tip of the wheel, the cutting wheel, have a stark angle, and then the one for the thicker glass actually has a more shallow angle. All right. Any questions so far?
And the shallow does what for the thicker glass?
Well, we have this misconception that in order to cut thicker or harder or more brittle glass, we have to apply more pressure.
Yeah.
But that's not true, because if you score too deeply, you do what I call scar the glass, and you do more than just break the surface tension. You interrupt the fluidity, and then you don't get a good clean break. So when you're working with thicker glass, again, that misconception, you don't necessarily want to go in deeper at all. You just want to break the surface tension. Okay? All right, so that being said, pattern glass, your pattern heads is what you use most commonly in all your work, and it's very important that you have a good glass cutter. It's the very start of the whole practice, and if you don't have a good glass cutter to start, it's just going to make everything after that more difficult. Okay, so this is a pistol grip. This is what we use here at the studio. I like it because it gives you the most force for the least amount of pressure. You're using your whole hand, you're using your whole body, and you're applying pressure as you travel. There are others available. There are pencil-like glass cutters. These are a bit problematic, I feel, because the tendency to hold them like a pencil actually lowers the angle in which you're on the surface of the glass, which means you're not going to get a good score line. They actually need to be used upright, so some people will use a fist to do so, okay? Or another hand holding technique is between your two fingers with your thumb down to guide. But they do actually apply a lot more pressure on your fingers. So if you have any arthritis or any difficulty in the hands, these aren't for you. Old school, a lot of the glaziers like to use them full fisted. They have a lot of control. There's other little fancy types out there as well. I forget what this one's called, a Thomas grip or a pinch grip or something.
Oh yes.
It sits in the crook of your hand. And again, it's all about maintaining that perpendicular line with your glass.
Wow.
A little tricky for me. You can see why we've stayed with the pistol grip all this time. It's just the most practical. Okay? Cutter heads can be replaced. If your wick dries out, you have to replace the whole glass cutter. Okay?
How do you know if it dries out?
If you can't, when people come to me and say, my glass cutter's not working, two things I check. Number one, is it getting oiled? So I get a piece of paper out and I run the cutter head. If I'm getting an oil line, it's getting oil. That's a good sign. Second thing you check is there any skip marks when you're rolling? Did you chip a piece of the cutting wheel, or is there a rusted out area of the cutter wheel or something like that? Then you would see a sort of a skipped, where it had that little flaw, there'd be a skip. Okay? That's how you know you replace your wheel. So when you're cutting glass, you start off with the right position. You don't want to cut sitting down. You don't want to cut on a table that is too low for you. You don't want to cut on a table that's too high for you. If you're limited in your movement and you're not getting full movement, elbow, hip, wrist, okay, you're going to get to a position when you're scoring where you can't go any further. And it's at that point that we do things like slide, lift, grind, okay? So you want to be fluid. Also consider the way you roll. So I always like to tell people, when you're scoring glass with cutting pizza with a pizza cutter, you are leading the direction of the score line and you are rolling. So you want to consider having that ability to lean over your glass cutter. Also consider which way you do that. So if I'm right-handed, more natural for me to flow to the left. Okay? Left-handed, more natural to flow to the right. So a lot of the times I'll move my glass so that it's in the right place for me to make a smooth score line. Always start on the glass. Always travel forward to another side. And you want to hear that sizzle, but not a grind, just a sizzle. When you're breaking your glass, you want equal pressure and you want to pull it apart. The different tools that you use to break the glass just help you do the more complex cuts. So I always go to the hands first if I can, whether it's knocking a piece to the side of the table or just snapping off a long strip, because it's fast. After that, or if I feel the glass is more susceptible to breaking, then I'll pick up the different tools. So we have a running plier. Something to note about the running plier. A lot of you are tempted to always choke up on your score line, but you really only want to go in as deeply as the black pad, because that's where the raised bump is. To go in further than that is actually starting the score, the break, after the score has started. Okay? So just right on the edge, lining up your indicator lines and squeezing. When you get into thinner strips and you don't have enough glass on either side of that bump, you need to switch tools, which of course I moved from the table because I was working over here. Okay, so then you want to switch tools. My next tool of choice is always the breaker grozer plier. The breaker grozer plier I think is universal. I think it's the tool you use the most, no matter what you do, stained glass or fused glass. And you always want to use it in the shape of a happy crocodile. That's what I call it. Okay, the curved jaw on the bottom, the curved jaw is the grozing jaw, and the flat jaw on top of the breaker jaw.
Oh, this is a very small one, not the wider.
This is the regular one, okay? And it does the same motion, snapping and breaking the glass. Now, when I get into deeper curves or shapes that definitely not conducive to run, a little more complex and maybe risky to just pull apart with my grozer, that's when I'll go to the ring star. Now the trick with the ring star is not expecting it to break on the first pass, because what you want to do is create a series of dots that will just connect. So I always start at one side and looking through the window, you just gently squeeze. I can see how the glass has started to run. So I'll move ahead of the break and gently squeeze, move ahead of the break. And you always want to be ahead of the break. Now we have the advantage here, this is just float glass, so we can actually see where that is. But in the opaque glass, if you turn it over, you can sometimes see also where the break is run. And I'm just going to keep going back and forth along the score line very gently until the piece comes out. Okay? This works especially well if you get into really complex, like very fragile like shapes. I may have come a little too close to the line there. Let's see if I can pull this off.
So that's how you do lettering.
That would make sense.
I'm asking.
I knew that was gonna go. It's not how you make lettering, but it's how you get really thin breaks out of very brittle glass.
But we could do lettering like an S
You might be able to try.
okay.
Yeah, especially with float glass anyway.
and J's.
So these are your most common tools. Your runner, your grozer, and your ring star. All starts with a good glass cutter. Any questions about the basic tools? Anyone have problems that they want to discuss and ask me, why when I do this, does this always happen?
I can't believe how much I learned on Saturday of little things.
Yes, a good trick we learned on Saturdays, whenever you're running long breaks, so borders, or in this case we were cutting long strips for the games table, dip the cutter in oil.
All the time.
All the time. When you're running long breaks like that, oil is key to successful
More
break.
than the oil that comes out.
More, yeah.
I
Okay.
still forget.
Especially with the opaque glass, it's good to be oily. Okay, so I got a couple other little tools here that are kind of fun I wanted to show you. Before I move into circles, I want to talk about the thick breaker. So when we make pot melts, it's always fun to refire them and create pendants by putting your glass on edge. And this stuff, once it's fired and thick, is really tough to break. So a couple things that are very helpful. One is the thick glass breaker. So when I'm scoring to break off, again, I'm not pressing extra hard. Some seeds on that glass surface. And then I'm using this really cool tool, which is a super breaker. And it works like the way a running plier does. So this actually goes underneath to apply pressure under the score line while this bar pushes down across the top. You'll put one on each side of your score. You've got to play a bit with this opening so that you get a good snug fit. A little too snug. Line it up. So it has an indicator line just like the running plier. Good. And squeeze.
Interesting.
Fabulous.
And then we've exposed
Yeah.
all this beautiful stuff inside. So we could again use the breaker.
You're not applying that much pressure.
No, it's not about the pressure.
No, I know, but it just, you know,
So from here, if I wanted to make smaller chunks for jewelry, I might switch to this tiled snip. It has a wider jaw than our stained glass snippers do. You get the nice smaller pendant. Like look at that flame in the middle there, that's gorgeous. Okay, and then I can refire this. It's nice and clean on the bottom, which is key.
yeah, mine are not.
Which is key. But what that lower angle does, it doesn't allow me to scar the glass as easily. It keeps it from digging in deeply into the surface of the glass, which is what's going to allow for a cleaner break. Great if you're doing pattern bars. It's always fun to open these up. And it's a cool toy to play with. Okay, so it does the fused glass, thick glass, much more easily. Right.
It's not hard.
This is another option they had before Morton border and circle system. So it works on a similar premise. You've got your wheels and a pivoting head. Same idea, you have to put your oil down in front of your cutter. You hold the center, apply pressure, and spin. Like so. But again, not as good as the Morton because you can't use your glass cutter, right? Your good glass cutter. Now the Glasstar circle cutter is probably the only exception to the circle cutting family that is not where you're using your own cutter head, but
Glass, be good.
okay, so this is a Toyo circle cutter. Same quality head as the pistol grip cutters that we use.
I like your bending.
Okay. It has a nice suction cut center. Okay, and then you can set the bar. So this one's set specifically for the tables. Again, you want to make sure you have clearance before you apply any pressure. And you want a bit of oil. Do I clear that?
Yeah.
Just make sure.
Awesome.
That sounds beautiful. That's what a glass cutter should sound like. Wow. I never see you use that too. Well,
It's this big surface.
it does big, yeah. It's primarily. Now, see if we have enough give on this table. The way I like to break the big circles out is turning it upside down and then pressing gently.
Already going.
So-
Yeah.
Big circles are much easier to break out than small circles. Much
at that.
easier.
Oh my goodness, look at that.
It's like a miracle.
And I've done 5 of those and I still don't do it.
So once I see that I've run the break all the way around, you see that?
Yeah, beautiful.
Okay. Then I'm going to score from the circle, away from the circle. So I don't want to be right on that circle score line. I'll be away from the circle score line and I'm going to pull towards me. So I do not want to cross that circle. Okay? And I'll just gently pop that. And on on the big circles, there's enough flex in the material that you can generally
Go all the way around.
lift it right out in one piece.
Wow.
Wow.
Beautiful.
Oh, yay.
And there's your
Fabulous.
tabletop.
That's
It
lovely.
listened to me.
Lovely.
Oh my goodness.
Very nice. Beautiful. Now
So-
that looks like an expensive tool too.
It is a very expensive tool, but it is been worth its weight. But there are smaller versions of it too. That's the large version. You can get a shorter version, so if you were doing more 12-inch circles or that kind of thing, for sure. Yeah. So probably the most important thing to know is to keep good care of your glass cutter. Keep it oily. Keep the wick wet all the time. We use a combination of transmission fluid and kerosene. Those formula put out by Toyo, so we'll trust them. It's their cutters. And don't force any break. Always go to another tool. Any questions?
No, super.
Thanks, ladies.
Great.
Thank you.
Back to work.